Today I'm going to share with you 7 lessons that I learned in the last 12 months as someone that has mentored over 100 composers that write concert music. Now, this is music that is meant to be played by soloists, chamber ensembles, choirs, and orchestras on a stage in a concert setting. Let's get started with the first lesson that I learned, and that is that it doesn't quite matter how young or old you are when you start or restart composing concert music. Let me explain. The 2 composers that I can think of, like right off the top of my head, that were among the fastest in their growth. One is in his 20s, and the other one is in his 70s. Really, the only commonality between the 2, their music sounds nothing like each other's music. They write in completely different styles and with completely different mediums and completely different aesthetics. But there was one commonality, and that was that they're writing at a consistent clip. They didn't really care if they were making mistakes along the way, and they just embraced the process that it's going to take some time for them to improve. And lo and behold, it didn't really take that much time. It took maybe a span of 6 months or so from where they started to where they are now. So that's lesson number 1. It didn't matter how young or old these composers were, they still were capable of improving rather at a very fast pace. Now, lesson number 2 is an interesting one because when I was growing up as a composer, I remember the first few pieces that I wrote this big thing, Symphony number 1, movement 1, Allegro, things like that. And I was 12, 13 years old when I wrote pieces like this. And I was writing pieces like this throughout my teens. The funny thing about this was I was writing these big orchestral pieces, but I had never really written any solo or duo or trios before that. And I see this a lot with composers, young and old, that they write these huge, kind of magnus opus pieces without first having the discipline to write solo works, then duos, then trios, then quartets, and so on. So the reason why we do this, we start with solos, then duos and trios and quartets, is that it starts building up this kind of collection of tools that you have as a composer. So for example, when you're writing solo music, you're purely focused on your handle of melody and rhythm for the most part, okay, a little bit of timbre as well, but you're not worrying about that harmonic aspect really as much. When you start writing pieces for duos, you're starting to worry a little bit about polyphony, but you're still worried about melody and rhythm, of course. When you start writing trios, you start thinking of 3-part harmony. When you're writing quartets, now you're starting to think about 4-part harmony, which is a big part of Western music, and so on. So that when you're writing that big orchestral piece, you already had so much practice doing all those other compositional parameters that when you get to the orchestra, it's not such a huge mountain to climb, because on your way to climbing that big mountain, which is the orchestra, you've already climbed a lot of these hills that got progressively bigger and bigger. This is the one big thing that composers I saw. The composers I saw that were patient with themselves and said, hey, let me start out with smaller ensembles. Those are the ones that got rewarded, because then they felt more confident in their skills and they felt confident to start adding instruments one by one. Now, lesson number 3 involves seeking out constructive feedback. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that, let's say that you're writing a work in progress. I'm not talking about a piece that's finished. I'm talking about that you have a work in progress and you have a specific problem with the part that you're stuck on. And you're asking a question, what do I need to do to get out of this problem? Let's say that, you have this motive and you don't know how to develop it further. Or let's say that you finish this section, but you don't know if it needs more or if it actually needs to be shorter, right? You need a third-party person to kind of identify some of these things. Now, the nice thing is when you're getting feedback on a piece of music, the person giving you feedback doesn't necessarily need to be an expert. The big thing that they have to have is an open mind and open ears. And if you're getting enough of this feedback, you're actually going to be able to filter this feedback. And by filtering this feedback, you are actually developing your own personal aesthetic bias. You start to develop your own personal style based on the feedback that you're getting. So the beautiful thing about getting feedback on your music is that eventually you'll be able to decipher what feedback is constructive to you, what can you actually use. And the feedback that you don't agree with is also good too, because it eliminates that solution to your problem. And what happens is you start to develop an idea of what it actually can be. So if you have this particular solution to the problem, right, that you don't agree with, it actually might have got you thinking about what actually needs to be done. But the truth is that if you didn't get that, let's say, feedback that you didn't like, you wouldn't have came up with this other thing. This happens so many times when I give lessons and so on, and when I see other composers giving each other feedback. This happens all the time, because then what you're forming is really the end result, which we want to have, is that each composer has has their own aesthetic bias. This is actually a great thing because when you have your own aesthetic bias, you actually know what you like and what you don't like. And when you know what you like and what you don't like, then you can write music because this music is going to be more personal to you, right? If you have an aesthetic bias. That just makes sense. Now, lesson number 4 that I learned was that the composers that improved the fastest were the ones that went back to the basics. So, even me, I have a bunch of screens here. I have a screen here. I'm looking at a screen over here. I'm looking at a screen over here. I have my iPad over here. I have a lot of screens. But when it gets down to it, when I'm actually composing my concert music, I'm working on a piece right now. This is a piece for Ensemble Proton Burn. It's a piece, or rather an ensemble in Switzerland. I'm writing it on paper, on manuscript paper. So going back to the basics, paper, pencil, and notation software, something like Sibelius, MuseScore, Dorico. This is going to keep you sane while you're composing because it limits the amount of tools that you have at your disposal. You don't need the fancy plugins, right? They're definitely nice. BBC, Spitfire, East West, those are nice things to have. But at the end of the day, they're going to distract you from actually composing original concert music. If we're talking about film music, that's a completely different ballgame. Of course, you're going to need those things. But if we're talking about concert music where the end result is having a recording or a performance by a live group of players or a live soloist, those tools are not going to be necessary. The tools that come with, or rather the sounds that come with MuseScore are really actually pretty good. Note Performer is a great tool to use if you're using something like Sibelius or Dorico. So these tools are going to actually be pretty decent at approximating the sounds that you want. And if you're using any extended techniques, of course, you're going to have to use a bit of your imagination. But by that time, if you're using those kind of techniques, hopefully those sounds are starting to get embedded in your head a little bit because you've heard them so many times played by instrumentalists over on YouTube or even in a live performance. Now, the other unforeseen positive of writing with paper and pencil first is that you start to develop your own kind of handwriting, your own kind of craftsmanship through the pencil and the paper. That way you actually start to form a little bit of muscle memory about what kind of gestures that you like. You can't do this if you're, improvising in a keyboard, especially if you're not a pianist, right? You can't really do this if you're writing straight into the notation software. If you're writing with your own hand, this idea of gradually having this kind of little bit of muscle memory that starts to form the basis of your personal aesthetic. This can really only be achieved if you're using this modality. Now, there are many professional composers that I know that write straight into notation software, one of them being the Wind Ensemble composer, John Mackey. I know that he writes straight into the notation software, but you also have to realize that a composer like that already has his aesthetic pretty much figured out. Every piece that he writes, you can tell it's by John Mackey. So in a way, he already kind of has his signature built in. He doesn't really need to go back to the paper and pencil when he's composing music. So just letting you know, at least in the very beginning, paper and pencil is very important so that you can start to form your own personal aesthetic. You can even do this if you're starting out composing. You don't have to wait 10 years in to start forming your own personal aesthetic. Now, lesson number 5 involves score study. Now, what I mean by score study in this particular case is not, okay, let me go see what the top 100 pieces in the classical repertoire are, and let me learn all of those pieces. That's not what I mean by score study. Score study to me means that you have a collection of pieces that you and you alone personally love. So it can literally just be a bunch of Baroque music from France, right? It can be just that era. It can be just a bunch of medieval music. It can be just the music of Brahms. It could be just the music of Elliott Carter or some combination of those things. But the important thing is that you individually have to be in love with these pieces. So that way, once you form a collection of these pieces that you can put on your hard drive or in a folder on your computer, when you encounter a problem that requires a solution in your composition, you can refer back to these composers and these scores that you love and these recordings, and you can say, hey, how did Stravinsky solve this problem? How did Bach solve this problem? And that way they become your trusted allies. You're not copying what they're doing. You're gaining inspiration from what they're doing in their scores and applying it to what you're doing in your current scores. Try it and you'll see that your music is going to instantly transform to something that's a bit more on a higher level, and you will definitely feel that too when you're doing this on your own. Now, as we move on to lesson number 6, I want you to have an open mind with this particular take, because at first glance, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense, but I promise you, this will save you a lot of headache, and that is on the topic of music theory. I have seen on the internet and actually in my own studies, there are basically two camps when it comes to studying music theory as it relates to writing concert music. Now, the first camp is that you need to learn as much music theory as possible, especially Western theory. You got to go from the medieval time all the way to the Renaissance and the Baroque and the classical, romantic, modern, postmodern. You got to know all of it before you can write a single piece of music. So that's one camp that I see. The other camp is on the complete opposite spectrum. You don't need to know any music theory. Just let the creativity flow through you. Any music theory you'll kind of figure out along the way if you need it, or you can figure it out by ear. And I think both of these kind of miss the mark when it comes to writing concert music. The big thing is that when you're writing concert music, especially if you're trying to go for a certain aesthetic, because you're trying to find your voice when you're composing, of course, is that people have different needs when it comes to music theory. If you're writing a piece that has no counterpoint, why do you need to be studying a bunch of fugues before writing that piece? Why do you have to master counterpoint to be able to do that? If you're writing a piece for a solo flute, why do we need to learn 4-part harmony before that? If you're writing a piece for string quartet that just involves violins, viola, and cello, why do we need to learn how to orchestrate or orchestra or for percussion or winds and all that kind of stuff? Why do we need to learn all of those things if we're just writing for string quartet? So in other words, music theory, orchestration, really harmony, counterpoint, really any of these topics that you're kind of told to learn as you're composing. Yes, you're going to learn them as you're composing, but if you learn them as kind of solutions to problems that you encounter when you're composing, it's going to be a lot more fun and make a lot more sense, because you're going to see that it's directly applicable to the composing that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, the music theory is a byproduct of what composers did in the past. Composers didn't compose because they knew music theory. Music theory was created after observing what composers like Monteverdi or Bach or Mendelssohn or any of these people did. The music theory came after, not the other way around. A lot of the times today, we see composers learning music theory first before composing. Again, there's two sides of the spectrum. I think it's somewhere in the middle. And just to give you a little example in terms of myself, I know a lot of music theory, orchestration, counterpoint, all that kind of stuff. I went to school for it. I have way too many degrees for it, right? But the main thing though is that I know that the deeper that I went through all these subjects, the more I discovered that I didn't know much at all. So for example, I'm writing a piece that involves an instrument called the archiorgano, which is an instrument that was created in the 1500s in Italy to basically create this 36-tone keyboard. I have to basically learn that system from scratch, basically. That's a completely new music theoretical concept that I have to learn. Because I'm writing that piece for that instrument, I'm embracing this. I'm embracing the fact that I have to learn this. And that is when I start learning it, not 10 years ago when I didn't need to know any of that stuff. This is kind of an extreme example because it's kind of a niche subject, but you can apply that basically to any part of music theory, orchestration, counterpoint, or any harmony that you might come across that you might need in a particular piece of music. Now, the last lesson that I have is not controversial at all, though it might be surprising to hear, and that is that the process of composing has to be fun. It has to be fun. You cannot be this tortured artist. You cannot be this distressed artist, right? This doesn't really work that well, because if we're not having fun while we're composing, guess what's going to happen? You're not going to want to compose at all. And if you're not composing at all, you're not going to be improving over time. The way that I actually found this out, because, to me, it wasn't intuitive as somebody that went to a lot of school for composing. There was always a lot of pressure to succeed. There was always a lot of pressure to win contests, awards. A lot of that pressure was exerted, actually, to be honest, on myself. And this is kind of like how I grew up composing. But it wasn't until I started mentoring these composers that I realized, hold on a second, these composers are not trying to be the next Mozart, right? These composers are not trying to have a bunch of orchestral performances. These composers are not trying to make a living composing. So why are they composing? So it got me thinking, actually, why don't you just ask them why they're composing, right? Because you kind of take it for granted sometimes that we compose, as somebody that is around composers and musicians all the time. So I just asked them, why are you composing? The answer was so simple. It just hit me like a freight train. It's that, well, I'm just having so much fun composing. I can't stop doing it. And when this particular person said that to me, and actually I kept hearing this in different forms by several other composers, I said, wow, that actually kind of is obvious in a way that you have to have fun while you're composing. For me, I don't say it's fun necessarily. I have a different mode of thinking when I personally compose. For me, composing is like going to church. For me, it's like this kind of zen-like couple hours in my day where I don't worry about anything else except what's right in front of me. It's a momentary experience. But for these composers, they were saying, no, this is actually fun for me. I hope you enjoy these 7 lessons here, and I hope that you learned something new and you can actually start applying it to the music that you're writing today. Have a great rest of your day and see you in the next one.